Mr. Roskrow, here you are.
Arthur, how are you?
I'm pretty fine, and you?
Yeah, this is the first time I've done Instagram. I have no idea what we're doing or who we're talking to or anything else, but good to see you. How are you, my friend?
I'm pretty fine. I mean, you've done everything you need to do. You're online, and we simply talk. It's our talk. It's you and me. We are friends.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm gonna start by asking because what I found happening in recent days, weeks, is that different places in the world are at different stages. Some are coming out, some are going in, some are still locked down, some are not. And it's very hard to write for a world market when you don't know where the reader is in their world. So it's obviously, I think the last place I came before lockdown was to see you in Switzerland and Austria. I think you were my last trip. And coming back through Amsterdam, I suddenly got scared. That was before it all started because the Asian travelers were all wearing masks, and I suddenly thought, oh my golly gosh, this is big. So, how's it been for you? Have you been able to do much during the lockdown, and where are you now?
Well, at the moment, I'm in my office, and you're totally right. I mean, you've been with us in March as a speaker on the Swiss Spirit Summit, and you've been talking about Alpine whiskey, and it went that fast. I mean, you left Thursday morning, and I think
Yeah,
we already had lockdown Monday.
yeah.
So,
And
you,
looking back on it, it's very strange because I was meant to go to the Lakes Distillery in the northwest, and it was a press trip. There were going to be seven or eight of us, and my wife said, "Look, I think this is starting to look quite bad." And she's got elderly relatives on their own, and she was going to have to. She said, "I really would like you to cancel that trip," and I said yes straight away. Normally I go, "Oh, don't be." I cancelled, but they were a bit. I think they were a little bit funny with me. Then, of course, within 4 days, they'd cancelled the whole trip, and they just wrote to me this week saying, "Wow, maybe you got it right first." But it happened very quickly when it happened, really.
but I mean, I think the UK has been the last ones to come, but they are also the last ones to leave the whole thing. I mean, we are open since last week. We had lockdown ended something end of May, and there was still a ban on events. So I had my first public appearance last Wednesday, and now it's we are getting back to some
Was
normal. I had
that
one
was me?
yesterday. I had one on Tuesday. So we're getting in. I mean, I planned to come and see you in UK for tasting IWSC, but obviously you still do have self-isolation at the moment.
Yeah, we're a long way. We were very late to lockdown at the beginning. This will all come out later, but what the British government did against the rest of the world was to say the best thing to do was to catch it and spread it, and basically have a herd immunity. So, like what they were really saying was the weakest will die, but the strongest will survive. And then they realised that actually that wasn't going to work. So we locked down very late, and we now have the highest per capita cases in the world, and we just passed 42,000 deaths today, and still going up. So we're a long way to go. England is different to Scotland and Wales. Scotland went downgraded today. So if there's any whiskey fans out there wondering if they're going to get to go to Scotland in the autumn or the European autumn, then it's looking pretty good. They went down to level 2 from 5, and that means they could be reopening their pubs with gardens in July.
Okay.
So they're ahead of us. They've got no more cases. The trouble is, England has made a mess up. And then we had a political scandal, which I won't bore you with, but everybody said if they can do it and go out, we can go out. And so we may have a problem again in July. We'll see.
I think we need to say hello. I think we need to say hello to all our friends which joined us. Interrogated Imbiber, Nancy Whitman is there. Also, Jessica is there. And yeah, Lala joined. So
La la la.
a big family. So we wanted to talk about New World Whisky.
Yes.
I think that's you're the one to go for international world whiskies. How did you get into world whiskey, Dom?
Um, well, as you know, I was editor of Whiskey Magazine, and it became clear that 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, became clear that I wasn't staying there. And so I came up with the idea of just getting on a cheap flight, an EasyJet flight to Germany or to Spain, and getting a distiller to put me up in a hotel. And then we'd go and see the distillery, taste the whiskey, go to the pub, drink lots, sleep, go to bed, go home, and then I'd sell the stories back to the other magazines. And so it meant that the distiller didn't pay anything. It was nothing. It was all my work paid for by the magazines. But what happened was I made lots of friends in distilleries across the world. And as time went on, I went further and further. And it just became, I was going to places that nobody had really written about because there was no money in it, because you know, who knew that Spain had a distillery? Who knew that there was good whiskey coming out of France? And now it sounds silly, but then it wasn't. And then what happened was the typical of the Australians. The Australians got very upset about the fact that in major whiskey awards, you have Scotland, Ireland, Japan, Canada, America, Kentucky, and then the rest of the world. And the Australians said, look, firstly, the expression makes us feel second rate. And two, our whiskey has nothing in common with India or Taiwan or France. So we don't want to be that anymore. So I said, okay, I'll do my own awards. And I'll call any country that wasn't in those 5 areas, I called New World whiskey. And that's where the expression came from. And the Australians started questioning age, because they'd say, well, we're maturing stuff 3 or 4 years and it's good. But because we're not Scotland. And they were saying 12-year-old as a standard means nothing if you don't know the size of the cask and the type of the cask and the humidity and the heat. So I went down that route of dividing the awards into by continents and treating them separately. That's what's happened, and it's been the best career move for me. This is how we met. You know, Marcel in Telstar in Liechtenstein. He was one of the very first European whiskies I wrote about. Do you remember he had a wooden box around the bottle?
Yeah. Oh, goodness me. The first he had was like a brick with a bottle stuck in it. Yeah, right.
But, you know, that's how I met Marcel, and that's how I came to know you. And now I can honestly say that, you know, I've got an international group of friends that I understand and love their whiskey, and they respect the fact that I do that. I'm sitting here with the latest release from Hartwood in Tasmania.
Oh, nice.
This is called Wizard's Scepter, and it's about 70% proof, which is typical of Hartwood, and it's a sherry bomb, big sherry bomb. And I'm using this as an excuse to have one tonight.
Okay. So, well, see, I do the same. I share this bottle with you as well.
Yes.
You might know it. This is this would have been the festival bottling of Whiskey Ship Lucerne. It's from our friends from Seven Seals. And I'm toasting with this to you as well.
Cheers.
Cheerio, my friends.
You too. And, you know, but nice things like this week, Anna Broger's been in touch with me. She's doing some charts, and she wants some stuff to say on it, and she wanted my contribution to that. And I love that, because it's such a lovely, and when you're locked down like we are, and you're able to do this and know that there's a world out there, and I know Australia's waking up out of it and you're waking up out of it, it's good for the spirit to know there's a future coming.
Absolutely.
So
yeah. Tom, you told us how you got into this world whiskey thing. How would you define world whiskey, and is there a distinct difference between world whiskey and new world whiskey?
No, I don't really. I think I divide the world into two: the established big countries, Scotland, Ireland, Kentucky, Canada, Japan, and then everything else I call New World. So even if it's an old world nation for wine, it's still a new world. Most people have not tasted Austrian whiskey.
Definitely.
And we'll talk about this in a minute. My next question for you is about this very thing, but as a result, it's new and exciting. And I used to do a company that sent out little miniature packs, and the biggest seller was the World Whisky, the New World Whisky pack, because I could see the wave coming. I could see it building. I knew it would become a surfing wave because I could see it swelling. Because a new young audience of whiskey drinkers wanted to know about new whiskies, and they wanted to know about micro distilleries, the small craft style distilleries across the world, and that includes America and now Scotland. Ireland's full of them. So to me, they're just anybody really that's not part of the old school. And I'm nothing against the old school. The old school is 2/3 of every book I do are on Scotland, obviously. But as a journalist or as a writer, the excitement is watching for the next wave and making sure you're surfing on it. So that's what I did.
Okay.
And
You just mentioned Scotland. What do you think? How big is the influence of Scotland to all those world whiskies?
Well, that's a really, really good question, because wherever you go in the world, two things. One is that the distillers, and you know this from the Alpine region, the distillers look up to the Scottish distillers as the best and the target you have to reach. And that's out there. The other thing is how many times you go somewhere and a Scottish distiller or someone like the late Dr. Jim Swan has helped produce the whiskies of the New World. So those two things are very important. There's no us and them. It's all together. But what I say is this: there are only two ways to make whiskey. You either make it like the Scots, and if you do that, you've got to be bloody good because they're the best, and that's your standard. Or you try and do something different, like the Irish have. The Irish have got their own style, triple distill, pot still. They're experimenting with different things. America's full of experiments. And when I go to Sweden, I hear the Swedish distillers trying to make a good quality Scottish style whiskey, and they are. But you go to Australia, and they're throwing the book out and saying, well, we're going to do it our own way. We're going to do it with our own peat, our own wood, our own mini casks. We're going to mature it in a different climate. We're going to cook it, basically, because it's Australia. And what we're making isn't a whiskey that's meant to be Scotch. So the influence is there, but actually the big debate going forward is, are you going to make a drink for Scotch drinkers, or are you going, which is why my awards have done well. And no disrespect to the IWSC and the IWC, they taste Scotch whiskey, they taste lots of wine, etc. And their parameters for world whiskey are defined by that. You taste Danish whiskey, and it's very different, and that's good because it suits the Danish palate. In Sweden, they use Swedish oak sometimes. They use Swedish peat, which is very salty because a lot of it comes from under the Baltic Sea, or did originally. Or they dry with junipers, which is how they dry their food for winter in Sweden. So that juniper taste, that smoked juniper taste in their whiskey, is something that is very familiar to Swedish palate. So, and that begs the question for you. Some countries want to have a flavor that represents them. Others want to do whatever they feel like doing. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, I've noticed the whiskies from southern Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Liechtenstein, not so much because I know Marcel's not producing, but the quality has gone way up. So why is that? And also, do you see different tastes developing away from Scotland as well as trying to be good Scotch single malt style whiskies?
Well, I mean, if we talk about our whiskies over here in the Alpine region, I mean, definitely the influence of Scots are there. I mean, if we talk about whiskey drinking, it's 80% of the people talking about Scotch whiskey. But I think mostly it stops there, because our distillers come from the fruit distilling side. They are used to do much more cleaner cuts than the Scots, and therefore they don't need to mature for such a long period as the Scots does. So you're getting into a totally different, not totally different, but in a different kind of aroma profile. It's much more crisp, it's more cereal, it's clean, it's to the spot. And sometimes it's almost overwooded. They very quickly became knowledgeable about how to use sherry casks and port casks and not new oak as they did in the beginning. So in the beginning, there was definitely Scotch influence, but I think now they moved quite a lot away from that. I would more say it's a little bit like either Canadian or Irish whiskey by style.
But I know you're a modest man, and so I know it's going to be very difficult to answer this next question. But when I started doing my awards, there were whiskies that were coming out of that part of the world that, despite what I said about different tastes, some of them were really nearly undrinkable. So there were some terrible, terrible whiskies coming out of, especially Switzerland. But now we're seeing different things. So can you explain? I know you have a huge influence in this because that's what you do. But can you explain what changed? Because it seems to me it's not just using used barrels. There's more to it than that. It's a production thing, I'm sure.
Poor. Yeah, well, at the beginning, it was quite hard for them. You've been over more than once. You know the concept of a fruit spirit, and it's the total opposite of a whiskey. I mean, if you talk about a fruit spirit, it's all about the fruit, no heads, no oily, fainty parts, just capture the aroma. And then they went over to cereals, and it's by far not only malted barley. They use corn, they use wheat, they use rye. So there's a whole universe, even spelt is used. So they use quite a big universe of different cereals to make their whiskey. And in the beginning, they did it the same way, like they would have produced a fruit spirit. And at the end, they put it into oak casks. And commonly, if you have an apple or a cherry distillate, it's more than you have a 20, 30 liter cask, and you leave it there for some weeks to get some oak influence, but still fruit is in the middle. And they did the same. And after a year or two, they realized the cask is too small, the loss is too big. And after 3 years, it's not whiskey, but it's oak extract. So that was the very first beginning. And from there on, they realized it's not only just the pure fruit. We need some more of the heavy components. We need bigger casks. We need pre-used casks. I mean, it's not more than 20 years that they started with the whole thing. And I think they are quite on a good path and at a quite good point now.
Yeah, it seems to me it's quite exciting that that there's a whole future for people around the world to discover. Do you think that's the next move really then for whiskies from your part? So a lot of it's language because I remember going once to a German distillery, and it was a very tragic story. I was told the owner of the hotel would sit down and drink with me because he was a big whiskey fan and he loved Mortlach. And he was in a terrible mood. And it turned out he didn't really talk to me. And it turned out he was very upset because his dog had been run over. And so my trip didn't go to plan. I sat on my own thinking, this is, The next day we drove to this distillery and it was in somebody's garage. It was just a shed with the dustbin for the distillery, And I said, well, I was meant to be writing a big article on this place for Whiskey Magazine, and there's nothing there. So I said, well, at least we can taste your whiskies. He said, no, it's sold out. They've all gone. He didn't speak any English. I didn't speak any German. And so we ended up tasting fruit liqueurs, fruit. But
I mean, that's quite describing how it all started. I mean,
yeah.
they didn't produce more than a cask in the beginning, and it went fast.
Well, they didn't need the publicity because they hadn't got the stock to sell. So you know, so I think, but now that's maybe changing. Maybe some of the because the other thing about the regional thing is that although there are micro distilleries, actually the companies behind them are quite big. Like Fana is a classic example.
Yeah.
Fana is a big fruit company. It's known all over Europe, and now it's built a very good whiskey distillery that's very small. So it has the beautiful bottles, and we see this a lot in your part of the world. Beautiful packaging, and now maybe the story is ready to go the next level and move out of Germany and German-speaking countries and into English-speaking markets. Next thing.
Well, I mean, I think you're totally right. Looking at the numbers, how many distilleries we have, and how many of the spirit is produced nowadays, we have very small distilleries. Like I'm pretty sure you can remember Sentisblick, the small on the hill.
Yes.
He's quite small. He uses small casks. I mean, he does sherry casks, and he does not only sherry cask, but also port and certain different casks on a 50-liter basis. So actually, it's mostly single cask whiskey. The influence is very strong. You can see it. This is a 5 years old now. And then we have the bigger end. And in Switzerland, the two big ones, I'm pretty sure you know them both, is Langetun and Sentis malt.
Yeah. We are, they now have both those two, I think, both of them, I think, certainly one, but I think both have UK public relations people now. And they're doing a little bit more than they were. I just think it's, there's a lot more to go. And you know, but it's great because both those two also are absolutely superb whiskies. And Langetun, it's the old bear, isn't it? The old bear and the old wolf, or whatever they're called. And but Sentis was always a favourite because that's what we were talking about. They use something in their production that gives a sort of church choir incense. When I was very little, I was an altar boy at church, and we used to have a thing, and you put incense on it, and it made it all smoke up, and you know, it was a very religious thing. And I think of it a lot because Bavaria is quite a Catholic area, and that part of the world is, and that taste in Sentis is. I know Sentis isn't from Bavaria, I know that, but what I mean is that smell, as I associate with Catholic churches back in England many, well, 40, 50 years ago. But it's beautiful and it's original. Same with Brugger. You know, Brugger's peated whiskies are like nothing else. It's not, they're not like Scottish whiskies at all.
No,
very good.
Especially also his burnout, which is obviously made from Islay malt, heavy peated Islay malt, but it's not at all tasting like a Scottish peated malt.
No, it's very, very interesting. And I think we'll talk a lot more over the coming years about different woods, about different styles of peat coming from vegetation. It's, you know, Australia, if you think the difference between Islay, where the peat is quite sweet and light because there's no roots in it, because there's no trees on the islands, and then the Highland peat, which is rootsy and savoury, and because of the... If that can be that much different 100 miles, or whatever it is, then Australian peat is massively different. And I think that's where we'll see some of the... I think also countries like Austria and Switzerland and even America, but certainly Australia, these countries are not bound by some of the restrictions that the Scottish distilleries have. So they can experiment with wood and peat. I know they can experiment with peat in Scotland, but I just think they're more likely to do it. And we're starting to see, and for me, that means I know I'm going to still have a job till I retire. Go
a long time to go for you. No way to. But you just came up with a very interesting topic, talking about the peat. So, see, Paul is there. Hello, Paul.
Paul who?
You came up with the peat and the differences of the peat. Do you think there is any more key influences on style for the world whiskies? I mean, we talked about the grain, and obviously here in the Austrian or in the Alpine regions, we use different cereals than just malted barley.
Yeah.
And any more influence? Would a whiskey made from rice, which we all heard it's happening, still would be a whiskey to you?
No, I've got very strong views on this actually, because although I like the idea of playing with the formula, I also think that it's really important that the Scotch Whisky Association and the Irish Whisky Association lay down. To me, they're like fortresses. They're like a castle with a stream around, a moat, and they're the rules. And you're either in it or out. And if you want to come in, you've got to obey their rules. And if you want to go out, then they'll shut the door behind you. And that's how it should be, because their standards are 1,000 years old. Both Ireland and Scotland, particularly, they perfected that over 1,000 years. We must never ever destroy that. However,
so the European regulation for whiskey are the pillars for you to talk.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the definition of 3 years maturation using an oak cup, using a wooden cask, the rules that Europe now has, and it's an interesting subject for when we exit next year from Europe, because Europe has fought very hard to protect Scottish standards in India and Australia. They've done an incredible job. So I really believe that should stay. But, and this is the big but, if you come up with a great tasting drink and it's made like whiskey, but it's not a grain, my favorite story about this is my French distillery, who I won't name because they wrote to me in French a long letter because I got in a bit of trouble, but I am right. They make their whiskey with buckwheat. Now, buckwheat in French is blé noir. Blé noir means black wheat. So they say buckwheat is a grain. Buckwheat is not a grain, it's a pulse. It's like rice. So you can't make whiskey with it. But they say the French government has sent them a thing saying blé noir is a grain. Well, I could say blé noir is a grain. It doesn't make it a grain. So their drink, their product is lovely. It's great. It's just not technically whiskey. Now, a lot of people say, well, you're getting into very small definitions there. But I'm not, because if you start take a craft beer in America and you make a whiskey spirit out of it, and it's got flavorings and it's got hops, it could be a great drink, but it's not whiskey. So I think we have to keep our definitions, but encourage people to be creative. If somebody wants to pay me a lot of money to come up with a new category name, then I'll do it.
That's a good idea. So, I mean, obviously, most of the Indian stuff is out of the game. I mean,
Yeah.
there are two distilleries in India. They do a brilliant job. The rest is molasses.
Yeah, and they've got. You go to. I went to Amrut. When I was at Amrut, I brought this up because it's a big issue. And Amrut make an awful lot of very cheap whiskey for the molasses whiskey for the domestic market, and it's a fraction of the cost of a single malt. The single malt is very much for the quarter of the population that's becoming very rich. But I asked them about it, and they said, look, we need grain. We've got poverty. We've got starvation. We need grain to feed people and not make expensive whiskey. It's a good point. But then you drink the stuff, and it's like rum, because that's what it is. It's sweet, it's unstructured, it might mix well in a Coca-Cola. I don't do blend, I don't do mixing, I drink straight. So, and I don't do that because I'm a snob, it's just the way it is. But I drank Indian products and thought there's nothing wrong with that, but it's too sweet and flabby and not whiskey. So I think one of the other things that's really important going forward, I'd love to have a column somewhere called Out There, because to me, when you've got a fortress, a castle, like Scotch Whisky Association, it's easy. They're the rules. You come in or you don't. But if I'm out in the desert, which is where I am, in a tent, there's all sorts of blokes out there running around, passing things off as whiskey. You can go to Las Vegas airport and buy a bottle of American champagne. No, you can't, but that's what they call it. So I think it's important that we allow the drinks. I'm nothing against that, but that we make it clear that they're not what we would call whiskey. Or if we're using the word single, it means it's from one distillery. If we're using the word malt, it's malted barley. Those rules have to stay. But it's an exciting time because you're absolutely right. I mean, I'd like you to tell me a little bit more, because I reckon I honestly believe the only person who could answer these questions more fully from an English perspective than me is Jim Murray, because he's always written about German and Swiss and Austrian. It goes back way beyond me. And he talks a lot about spelt, and he talks about rye, and the European rye, not American rye, obviously. So is this the potential for the Alpine regions or the Germanic regions to spread their wings and go elsewhere? Because they are legitimately whiskies.
Well, yes and no, because I think the German language areas, the Alpine whiskey regions, don't follow those beaten tracks like this is a classic rye in an American understanding. It's just they produce a whiskey quite clean, and it's either rye or it's malted barley or it's wheat. And then they use mostly, we haven't had access to bourbon casks in the very beginning, and it's still quite limited because it's a limited good. So they used, because we have wine here, they used quite a lot of wine casks to mature. So either we have white wine cask, which is Chardonnay, or red wine cask, which is mostly Pinot Noir. And then it's first fill. So that changes the profile quite a lot and gives maybe a little bit of a sweetness like a sherry finish would do.
I think that's really exciting. I think there's so much that can be done through that. But do you remember, not this year, but last year, when we were tasting the whiskies in your event, and I put a star next to two whiskies that really stood out for me, and they were both the ones that had been forced into the pressure thing. So this was tasting like a 12-year-old or 15-year-old Scotch, and it was less than 3 years old, so it's not even whiskey. And you talked at the time, and I was a bit worried because you talked about maybe giving it an innovator award. But I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, actually, there's a place in Silicon Valley in America that reckons it can create the molecular structure of Scotch overnight in a laboratory. I have no problem with that as long as it clearly says what it's done.
Yeah.
Window is open. We can see what you did. That's fine. There's no smoke and mirrors. We must know what you did. It's a trick. It's a clever trick, but it's not magic. So we need to be able to...
Well, someone would say it's magic, but I'm totally with you. But I think we will leave that a little bit outside. I do believe we come back to that topic with the 4 spirits experts when we're getting you in for that, going after all those hot climate maturation, maybe doing a topic about forced maturation. So we're looking forward to that. But after having all those interesting topics, one thing I really do want to talk with you is, what about terroir? Or what about where does it come from and what is it labeled? I mean, if we talk about Scotch, obviously it's Scotch. And if it's labeled Swiss whiskey, it's Swiss whiskey. And if it says Indian whiskey, it might be Indian whiskey. And if it's bourbon, it comes from the US. But within recent times, you read more and more probably about whiskeys coming from one of those classic New World countries that's not even produced there. What's your view on that?
Well, that's a really good question. I go back to my previous answer firstly, that it's got to be transparent. If you take a cheap European spirit, I'm not knocking the source, but say a cheap European spirit, and you take it to Ireland and you put it in a bottle and call it Mickey Flynn's whiskey, you're telling the world that Mickey Flynn's an Irish name, so it's whiskey, and you put an E in the word whiskey, so it's whiskey with an E, so it's Irish, and the guy's called Mickey Flynn's. You're going to think it's an Irish whiskey. If you bought that from Europe cheap, bad stuff from Europe, or even a major supplier in Scotland, whatever, and you pass it off as you imply it's an Irish whiskey. That's just wrong. You're cheating. You know, I just been asked by a writer to read his book and maybe do a descriptor and maybe do a forward for it on Japanese whiskey. And he's had legal letters from certain Japanese companies because he's said in the book that the spirit in the bottle isn't made in Japan. And I don't know the whole story yet because he only just contacted me, but he told me he had legal letters saying, we will stop your book because we don't want people to know that. Of course people should know that. So to us, interesting because the other side of the answer is there are people like Bill Lumsden in Scotland at Glenmorangie, Mark Rainier, who's now got a distillery in Ireland, who've always believed in the terroir. Brooklady still does it, still has, you know, an Islay. They'll still talk about Islay grain, and they'll even talk about specific fields and the idea of terroir in whiskey, I don't buy into entirely because two reasons. One, I'm not a wine snob. I'm not into, you know, I don't know how much it really matters if you know what field the grape was grown in or the barley was grown in. But secondly, I don't know how much difference it actually makes. They would say it does, so they're the experts, I'm not. But I think the concept of terroir, as in what grain, what water source, where the peat actually comes from, I'm not so interested in that. Me personally, I think is important to the consumer is that if you buy a Japanese whiskey, it's Japanese, and it's made to the rules we discussed. That it's, it's matured for at least 3 years in an oak barrel or a wooden barrel, and I think that some countries are developing very specifically their own taste, which is great, but it doesn't need to be the case. So to us, difficult. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'm totally with you in that regard. I think I may disagree to say yes. I think terroir, as far as we go, that there is terroir for whiskey, is important. I mean, if we talk about terroir, it's about where does the peat come from if you have a peated whiskey from India, because there is no peat in India or in Japan. It comes from Scotland. So again, we have a very tight influence of Scotland in those countries. If it says Japanese or Swiss or Scottish, it needs to come from there. I mean, no matter where the grain comes from. I mean, in Scotland, if you produce a Scotch whiskey, the grain doesn't need to be British. That's okay.
And you can't see, but out my window, I live on the east coast of England, and out my window are barley fields. And I talk to the farmers a lot, and their early grains that come in April, May, they go to make beer and whiskey.
Yep.
And the east coast of England sends a lot of our grain. The last thing a Scottish distiller needs is the Scottish National Party telling them that you must say where all your ingredients come from, there is a movement to do that.
Absolutely. But at least it's made in Scotland and matured in Scotland and then bottled in Scotland. And as far as that applies, I'm pretty happy to call it Scotch or Austrian.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I don't think it makes a blind bit of difference. I also think the rules over bottling are a little bit strict. My little bottling company got closed down by threatening letters from the Scotch Whisky Association because we were taking a bottle of whiskey from Scotland and we were refilling miniatures. And we were doing a great job for the industry. The industry didn't mind at all because what we were doing was saying, here's an Islay pack, taste 5 Islas in little bottles, and if you like them, then maybe you'll buy a big one. And we were paying for the whiskey, so nobody cared except for the Scotch Whisky Association because the new rules said you can't bottle Scotch whisky in England. As soon as we took it out of the bottle and put it into another bottle, it wasn't Scotch anymore. So they threatened us. That's why we ended that business. So I'm not sure how important that really is, because the taste of the whiskey was exactly the same when it reached my customers.
Yes, sure. And it doesn't change if it's a Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, or Bruichladdich. It's no more Scotch, but it's Bruichladdich made on Islay in Scotland.
Yeah.
As easy as that.
Sometimes over the years, I'm going to say this live. I can't believe I'm saying this. Oh dear. But sometimes Scotch Whisky Association loses.
Mike, have you read what Michael says? SWA sometimes is a bit over the roof.
Yes.
Maybe they are.
But he's put okay. You may say that. I can't possibly comment. But that's exactly what I was going to say.
No one wants you to comment officially.
Sometimes they forget what they're there for, you know. The roof's not leaking. Stop trying to put big planks on it, you know. Glen Scotia had this issue. McMyra's had it, and we had it as well. And it's a shame, because our little business was fun, and me and four other friends, four of us, had a lovely little business. It made us nothing in money. We treat ourselves to, we got about £1,000 each a year, but we had a lot of fun with it, and we had to stop. I mean, we literally had to start and close the website down. So, but anyway, I don't mean to knock the SWA, because for the reasons I said. If you look at what I've said, my views aren't negative about the SWA at all.
Paul just said, I used to supply your company back then, Dom. I thought the packs were a great idea.
Oh, thank you very much. Great, thank you. See, I didn't know that, but then Tony Wagner is my best friend. He was the man who dealt with the business, and all I did was write reviews and tasting notes and stuff like that. So, but thank you, that's really appreciated. Yeah, it's a shame. And other people are doing it similar, but they've taken, like Master and Malta had to take their operation to Scotland to do it. So, you know, they do a similar thing. But yeah. So what next for so what's happening now with whiskey in your part of the world? What's next and what's happening? I still think we've got unfinished business, you and I.
Well, we discussed that thing, and we should get that sheep off the ice. Obviously, next thing to happen here.
I started tasting samples as we speak.
Next thing to happen here is obviously Seaside Whiskey Festival in October here on Lake Constance. Hopefully.
Oh, you think you can do that?
Well, we're scheduled on track. I do believe we can do it.
Right.
We got 30 days notice period if we see we can't. But I do believe we have other big fairs in autumn that are scheduled to happen. So that hopefully will happen, and then we go into a winter season. There will be the whiskey ship in Zurich, and then hopefully in March next year we have whiskey ship Lucerne again.
That'll be great.
How it goes. And I hope we see us in summer or latest in autumn.
Yes, because they're talking, Le Concours du Mondial is talking about doing its event in Belgium now. Yes. In October, I think, or in the winter. Yeah. I just need to get out and have a beer with you, man. I tell you what, I was really jealous. I don't know how we're doing for time. I have no idea what time it is. You'll have to monitor all of that.
That's okay. We're on the last minutes, but tell me.
Oh, we really?
Yeah.
Well, I think it goes like that. I have no idea. I have to say, you were talking about that cider place. I'm so jealous. I missed that so much. We went there. That's where we did our judging. But the drinks in the bar there, the side. I love apple spirits and I love apple drinks. I'm drinking. My favorite drink is cider. You know, when I'm not tasting. So things that you missed. Well, that would be in my top 5.
Great.
Yeah.
So hopefully we see us very soon again.
Yeah. Anytime you like. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And I'm really sorry we're not meeting in July. I know. I thought you thought it might happen, but we're still a long way off. I doubt we'll be allowed back into the. Certainly, the English won't be doing anything till September. I got my New Zealand passport, so I'm ready to bugger off it.
Okay, my friend. Keep safe.
Yeah, you too.
And we speak soon. Thank you very, very much for your time, Dom. And
no, not at all.
thanks for
Not at all.
everyone watching. It's been a great thing.
Yeah, love to everybody out there, and I obviously can't see any of you, but and love to your lovely family, Arthur, and I look forward to the days when we can watch the son playing football again.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Dominic,
Cheers.
have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.